Every once in a while, people would find interesting things within their own properties. During renovations or redesigning old structures, some would discover secret rooms or even a cave underneath their houses. There was a man who actually proved a very old myth of the Derinkuyu underground city when he accidentally found an entryway within the walls of his house. In our case, we stumbled upon a giant maze beneath our home. We were planning to install some underfloor heating when we discovered something unimaginable. The house that we inherited from our father was much older than us. We barely knew anything about its history since my old man also inherited it from his grandfather, which he got from my great-grandfather and from the earlier generations before him. We spent a huge sum of money in order to renovate and modernize the place so we could live in it comfortably. When we got to the kitchen and removed the wooden flooring since it was already rotting, we found an old hatch hidden under the planks. The door was made of heavy metal, and it was obvious that it wasn't accessed for decades. The cast iron hinge was very ornate with decorative spiral patterns, like what was often seen in ancient dungeons and medieval castles. There were 2 handles on each side, unlike the usual hatch doors with only one. My siblings and I were quite speechless as we stared at this peculiar hatch that seemed long forgotten. We were all quite excited to open it and see what was inside. I tried to forcefully open the hatch by myself, but it was far too heavy. It was then when I realized why there were 2 handles on the door. It had to be opened by 2 men on each side. I thought that it was quite an inconvenient design since these things were usually cellars or bunkers that should be easily accessed by one man. My brother Jamie and I lifted the door open while our sister Elena shone a torchlight inside, and the 3 of us were baffled by what we saw. It wasn't a cellar nor a bunker. There was a spiral stairway leading further down below, and the light from the torch couldn't reach the bottom of it. The stairs were quite narrow, and they were carved from the ground itself like a passage to a man-made cave. Jamie took the first steps and carefully descended to take a peek at the bottom. He went for about 20 steps down, but we told him to climb back up when we were already losing sight of him. At that moment, we already had a feeling that we came across something quite astounding. We were guessing that it might be an old cavern, a forgotten crypt, or perhaps even an entryway to a place with historical significance. The 3 of us discussed our next course of action, and we imagined the potential fame and increase in value of the property because of this discovery. However, we didn't want to risk the possibility of losing the house since it was the only thing that our father left to us. If what was down there had a historic value, the government might try to buy the property whether we agree to it or not. In all honesty, I was hoping that we could find something that we could sell in hopes of recovering some of the money we had spent just to fix this old place. After all considerations, we decided not to mention it to anyone unless we see what was down there first. Sadly, our attempt to explore the underground on our own was a very big mistake. In order to keep it for ourselves, we lost something more precious instead. Not knowing what to expect, we prepared what we deemed as necessary before climbing down the stairway. We bought more reliable torchlights, glow sticks, oxygen bottles, and a few tools for excavating. We even prepared a harness if ever we would need to climb. Jamie was quite athletic and had a fair share of experience in rock climbing, which might be essential for the task, and so we followed his lead. One would think that we were overthinking and had prepared far too much just to climb down the hatch beneath the kitchen floor, but we all have seen enough documentaries about unexpected discoveries. We rather be well equipped instead of regretting it later. However, nothing could have possibly prepared me for the inexplicable horror that I experienced down there. Excited and nervous at the same time, Jamie and I started walking down the stone spiral stairway. Elena was left on the surface so she could immediately call for help if anything would happen. We kept in touch through our phones, and it felt that nothing could go wrong. After half an hour of going down, it seemed that the stairs were unending. There was no way to tell how deep we were at the time, but it should be at least 300 feet. The spiral stairway made it so hard to descend since we kept on spinning around. Jamie seemed fine, but I was starting to feel dizzy as I followed him from behind. The stairs went wider and smoother as we went further, and we suddenly felt a breeze coming from below. There was an opening at the side of the wall which supported the stone stairway. Right below the last steps, there was an entrance that led us to a spacious room. Jamie and I were both completely astounded by what we saw. For such a space to exist beneath the surface of our home was quite unimaginable. The stone ceiling was at least 30 feet high. Aside from its large space, the wall that surrounded us had intricate carvings on them. There were a number of antique sconces mounted all over the place. Jamie took one of the torches from its mount and he said that it was quite heavy. I took a closer look at the torch and I realized that the handle was made of silver. Not the best material to hold a fire, but we were certain that it would sell for a very high price. We couldn't help but smile as we counted 6 torches hanging on the wall. We could get a good sum of money just for selling these things, and we were just at the entrance. We started to think that climbing down there was quite worth it, but what happened next was nothing but a nightmare or perhaps the consequence of our greed. Right in front of us was a forked path divided by an imposing wall that dwarfed our height. Along the entrance, there were engravings of symbols on the floor that we haven't seen before. Jamie and I thought there might be something more valuable behind the walls, and so we went in without thinking twice. When we stepped beyond the engravings to see what lied ahead, there was a sudden gust of cold wind coming from inside. We suddenly felt uneasy for no reason, but I still insisted to move along. We cautiously entered the path on the left side while dropping glow sticks on the floor so we could easily find our way back. We haven't heard Elena's voice for quite a while, and we just realized that our phones weren't getting any signal. We should have turned back at that point, but we didn't know better. We also noticed that the path we were crossing was arced. The wall on our left was convex while the wall on our right was concave. We kept on going until we reached the end of the curve, but there was nothing there but another split path. After walking blindly in the darkness for a long time, we saw nothing but divisions of trails one after another. Jamie and I looked at each other as we realized that we were inside of a maze. We were walking around for more than an hour. The sharp turns and passages were getting confusing, and Jamie was running out of glow sticks. He also said that he was feeling lightheaded for some reason, and his sight was getting hazy. Since it was too risky to proceed, we finally decided to turn back. We were planning to retrace our path by following the glow sticks that we left on the floor, but after going back a few meters from where we were, we couldn't find any of it. We recalled the turns that we took while trying not to panic, but everything looked the same. Jamie and I began to argue as our fear and anxiety kicked in. He said that he was dropping a glow stick within 5 meters from each other so we could easily see it, and I actually saw him doing so, but they all mysteriously disappeared. We tried our best to remain composed so we could think of our way through this predicament. We assumed that the maze was in a circular shape with multi-course paths since the walls and roots were curved. If that was the case, we just had to get to the outer side of the wall before us and the next until we reached the outermost section. However, our logic was completely thrown out the window when we suddenly found ourselves right at the center of the maze. We were certain that we were making the right turns in order to get to the other side of the wall. It didn't make any sense at all. I was beginning to think that there was something in the maze that was messing with our minds. I started to scream out of frustration. I blindly walked into the dark, and then Jamie suddenly pulled me back while shining his torchlight to the floor. At the very center of the maze where all the diverged paths ended, there was a gaping hole at the floor. I would have fallen right into it if Jamie didn't see it. We shone our torchlights inside it in an attempt to see the bottom, but our lights didn't even reveal the surrounding walls of the hole. I plucked a button off my shirt and tossed it in so we could at least estimate the depth when it hits the bottom. However, it did not make any sound at all. It looked as if the hole was nothing but a complete void, and we wondered how this was even possible. Few moments later, Jamie went down on his knees and stretched his head right above to the hole. He said that he was hearing some voices coming from it, but I wasn't hearing anything. All of a sudden, Jamie's body jolted off the floor. He fell a couple of feet away from the hole as if he was hit by something big. His body began to violently quiver while he screamed in pain. He claimed that there were voices yelling inside his head, and they were all full of rage. There was nothing I could do to help him. I didn't even know what was happening to him. I tried to lift him up, but he aggressively pushed me away. His voice turned coarse and deep. He growled like a wild animal as he tore his own hair off his head. It looked as if he was desperately trying to restrain himself. I asked him what he wanted me to do, and his response was perplexing and profoundly terrifying. As his eyes rolled up, he told me to run. I didn't want to leave my brother behind, but my mind went completely blank. There was something from the hole that possessed him, and it was after me. Jamie was trying his best to hold himself down so I could get away. My survival instinct took over my emotions, and I just ran as fast as I possibly could without looking back. It was pointless to retrace the path since nothing in this maze was making any sense anyway, so I just kept on taking random turns. He was already chasing after me, and all I could do was listen to his growl so I could tell how close he was. I was running out of steam, and I was beginning to feel hopeless. But just as I was at the brink of giving up, I suddenly heard the voice of Elena calling our names. There were also voices of 2 other guys that I couldn't recognize. I immediately replied as loud as I could, and then 2 officers showed up in front of me with Elena right behind them. Apparently, Elena already called for help when she couldn't contact us for more than an hour. She told them about the situation, and 2 officers came to look for us. They unholstered their guns when they heard the growls coming from the maze. They thought that there was a wild animal chasing after me, but it was nobody else but Jamie. Elena was hiding behind them while holding one of the silver torches. When she heard the growl, she took one from the sconce to use as a weapon. The officers told her to stay at the entrance, but she strongly insisted to come along. Few minutes later, our possessed brother showed up from behind. The officers couldn't believe what they were seeing as I tried to explain to them what happened. Elena began to cry. I pulled her back when she tried to approach him. The officers gave a warning shot, but he kept on charging towards us. Jamie was no longer himself, and we couldn't restrain him. When one of the officers shot him in the leg, he turned away and ran. We kept on running forward from one section of the maze to the other. Surprisingly, we eventually got out of there. I told them everything that happened to us inside the maze, and they didn't believe me at first. However, they realized that I was telling the truth when the other officers who went down there to find Jamie didn't find their way back as well. They asked us how we were able to get out of the maze, and I told them what I thought. There was something supernatural about the place, and it seemed that the person had to bring a silver torch with him in order to not get lost. We were only able to escape the maze because Elena was carrying one when they found me. They did what I said, and they were able to map the area and also found the hole at the center of the maze. Unfortunately, we never saw my brother again. A few days after the incident, men in black suits came to visit us and offered a hefty price to buy the property. We wanted to decline the offer, but our local officers strongly advised us not to say no to these men. They worked for the government, and it will be in our best interest to simply comply with their demands. We decided to live on a different country and move on with our lives. We didn't know what happened to the house since then, but I will never forget the day when I got lost in that maze.